Hello, everybody. Welcome to a Sunday edition of Hawk Blogger Mornings. I'm Brian Nemhauser. You can find me on Twitter at Hawk Blogger. And, I do have to always say this because inconsistencies annoy me. And the fact that this show is called Hawk Blogger Mornings, every time I do this in the afternoon, it annoys me. But it is in the afternoon on Sunday, and that was the only time that I could make it work today. I think the most important thing here is 42 straight days of going live. We're going to keep pushing this along, see as long as we can keep that streak going. As one streak did end today, but not related to the Seahawks, related to the Mariners. And we've got to keep this streak going. I am giddy that my co-host, Jeff Simmons, at Real Jeff Simmons on Twitter, I just sent him a note on a lark and said, "Hey, man, I'm going live later today. Do you want to join?" And he's like, "Yeah, it works great." Sure enough, I get to talk sports. I get to talk Seahawks with Jeff. It's been a while. How you doing, man?
I'm good. I heard Mitch on the other day. He was bragging about like being on twice. Do I get that, or am I like just part of your community already? Am I a 2-time guest here, or does that count?
I feel like you qualify as a co-host on anything related to this channel. So
Fair.
So it would be like giving a cast member on SNL, credit for showing up. But you definitely are welcome whenever, and I know people love having you on here. So there's a few things we're going to catch up on, and I think one of them, Jeff, that we'll talk about is this thing from Colin Cowherd and what he predicted for the Seahawks. I'm actually going to see if I can pull up. I had this up before. I should have had it queued up, but I literally was just running into the house right before this to get on air. Where the Seahawks are going to finish. And I think we'll talk a little bit NFC West in general. And before I get to the Cowherd piece, which obviously is the main piece we're going to talk through, what is your default assumption about how this division is going to end up? Have you looked at like betting odds? What are you thinking as the default expectation for this division?
I think the clear expectation still is that the Niners are the class of the division, and they're the betting favorite. The Rams, there's a lot of people who like the Rams. They had a good offseason, but I know like a lot of people like their draft. A lot of people like what they've done with the offensive line, but I don't think the idea that Aaron Donald can walk away and they get better. I think people, they get so focused on offseason additions and things like that. Matthew Stafford was awesome last year, but the way that Donald is just a force multiplier for everything they do defensively, like all of the progress that they made last year could just be evaporated with his absence. And obviously they did well in the draft, but I think the Rams are still, to me and to a lot of the betting markets, I still think they're that second team. I know a lot of people will want to try to be cute and they'll want to be like, okay, it's the Rams year. I'm still looking at that Aaron Donald thing, and that's such a big loss. I think for the most part, Seattle's that third. People don't know what to make them. Their over-under number we've talked about before is 7.5. People don't know what to make. In year one, the way I look at the team right now, we're going to talk about this a little later, I don't know if like contending for a championship is realistic or anything like that. I see them as something that we're just hoping that we can see that they're starting to build something by the end of the year. My expectations of wins, I'm not even sure what it is yet. And then a lot of people like Arizona because of the volume of their draft. I actually didn't like it so much. So a lot of people will try to think Arizona's that up-and-coming team. They've drafted, 2 years in a row. I actually think they've missed a lot of opportunities, and it really depends on your view of Kyler Murray and the coaching staff. And they've added a lot of new bodies, but I don't know how many difference makers they've added. So
I love that. I want to get into each of those teams with you a little bit more because I definitely have some takes, and I'm really curious your thoughts. Let me know. Can you hear this? If I'm going to get this queued up here, let me know if you can hear this.
Last year they got that O-line right. I'm going to
take You're hearing that right? Okay. So let me cue it up a little bit further. This is Colin Cowherd, and this was 4 days ago doing division predictions for the NFC West.
Rams had a great draft. I think they played at the end of last year. They got that O-line right. I'm going to take the Rams to edge out San Francisco in that division, and Matt Stafford is the difference. Puka Nacua now going in. Cooper Kupp is healthy. The O-line is fantastic. The Niners' offensive line is very much in question, and we don't know their receiver situation. They'll be good. I don't think they'll be quite as good as last year. They're second. Arizona third. I got to be honest with you. I think Arizona has a chance to make the playoffs. I watched them at the end of last year. That new coach, they play hard. They play hard. And Seattle, a talented fourth-place team. I'm from the Pacific Northwest. I don't get any joy out of saying Seattle is fourth, but that's what I see.
So there you go, Jeff. You said you had heard this when it came out. What was your initial reaction when you heard that?
It sounded like Colin gave this like 10 seconds of thought and put it together to fill some air. Like even his like answer of Seattle, like he didn't put anything into that. And Colin now owns a podcast network called The Volume, and he does a lot of shows with a guy I really like named John Middlecoff. And when you listen to Colin, he does a weekly podcast with him, and he's so inconsistent with his takes. Like he'll go on there and he'll talk about all the time, like how talented Seattle's roster is, but they have Geno. And so the way Colin's really come off, he's got two takes and how it shapes all of his thinking. And if you listen to Colin a lot, there's two things he always talks about. One, he thinks any team that doesn't have an offensive head coach is like failing. He will not even give a second of thought to a defensive head coach. And like last year, I remember Geno has that great game against Dallas. And Colin comes out the next day and talks about how the Seahawks will never win a Super Bowl with Geno. And he's not crazy off there, but it was just like the timing of that was so absurd. It was just like the defense just let 41 points up. And all of Colin's takes seem surrounded around, do you have an offensive head coach? And who's your quarterback? And if you don't hit those two areas, it just shapes every opinion he has. And that's why he loves the Rams. And he's buddies with McVay. And I think he made a lot of, and well, you might be wondering, why does he like Arizona? But in his mind, there's Kyler and there's Geno, and Kyler's better than Geno. That's why he does it. And like just the analysis on Seattle was so empty. It honestly felt like he did that in 10 seconds. So I don't know if you took it differently.
It's just a fun thing to talk about. So I don't know how seriously I take it. I'll say this because I try not to be super reactionary and clickbaity in general. I will say that the Seahawks finishing fourth in the division is not a crazy thing to me. I don't think that's like a wild thing to say or absolutely impossible. You got a first-time head coach, an entirely new coaching staff, a offensive coordinator who has never coached in the NFL, who is bringing a new scheme. You've got a team that already was, relatively mediocre the last couple of years. Of course, like I don't think that's crazy to think that if things go the wrong way for the Seahawks, that the worst case scenario for the Seahawks is finishing last place. That said, it hasn't really crossed my mind that that's a likely outcome. I really don't think that is a. I don't think that is a. In 20% of the scenarios, I don't think that that's even likely to happen. So it feels like an outlier type of scenario for that to happen. And when he went through his reasoning, let's take them like kind of one by one. He picked the Rams to finish first. And Jeff, I want to ask you, I will just share. I think the Rams had the best offseason in the division. When you look at their free agency and you look at their draft, I think they had the best offseason in the division. I think that includes, to your point, losing Aaron Donald, which is a big loss, massive loss. But I agree with Cowherd on the offensive line. You've heard me talk about it. I think they've done a miraculous job in 2 years to make that line over. that was probably my biggest criticism of their draft. I think they had a chance to really put the period of the exclamation mark on the end of the sentence by getting a left tackle in a tackle-heavy draft, but they're going to stick with Alaric Jackson, and he's not awful, but he's a little bit worse than Charles Cross. So that's my only criticism, but I do really like that. Then you've already got a ton of offensive weapons. You've got Matthew Stafford. But the thing I see with the Rams, Jeff, and why it feels wild to put them at first is two things. One, they are a Matthew Stafford injury from being one of the worst teams in all the NFL.
Do you know who their backup quarterback is?
I do. It's Stetson Bennett.
No, Jimmy Garoppolo.
Oh, Jimmy Garoppolo. That's right. Yeah. I mean, I don't think this is I think Matthew Stafford played one of his best seasons last year, and he's got to repeat that first off, and then you got to keep him healthy. I just think that's a big risk. And the other one is this defense, while I like some of what they've done, I think there's a lot of question marks. A lot of things have to come together for it to be. I think they could. I would pick the Rams over the Seahawks right now, but I would not pick them over the 49ers.
Yeah, I'm totally with you on that. I think the Rams are pretty clearly the team that did have the best offseason in the division. But obviously, there's two losses on defense, Aaron Donald, and then they also lost Raheem Morris, who's been a really good coordinator for them. They have a guy who was their linebackers coach taking over, and their talent level has dropped off. They got in those two Florida State people, Fisk and Jared Verse, who we really liked. It was a gut punch that he went there. But the way that Aaron Donald just creates and can cover up a lot of their deficiencies in the back seven, that's going to be a big question. They are not talented. They're relying on Tre'Davious White, who's had an ACL and an Achilles in the last 5 years. They bring back Darius Williams, who's on his third contract now, who was really good when they had Jalen Ramsey. But there's just a lot of question marks on that defense. And you're right. Before last year, they tried to trade Matt Stafford. They tried to trade him. They thought his injuries were going to wear out. And watching him play last year was one of the more shocking parts of the season. I thought he was maybe the best quarterback in the whole NFL last year. And now they're moving Steve Avila to a new position at center. Jonah Jackson has had injury questions. But listen, if you're building a team around an offensive line, they became a much more power-running team last year, which is why they went out and got bigger offensive linemen. And Kyron Williams, and they got Blake Corum. So I like everything they're doing on offense makes a lot of sense to me, but Stafford has just been so beaten up in his career. I think the idea of just assuming he's going to be healthy to the point where we thought he was going to retire, I would struggle with that. I think there's a lot of question marks with that team, but they're really well coached. They have great personnel on offense. I'd be shocked if the Seahawks lap them this year. I think the Seahawks are a year away from really contending with those kind of teams.
That's interesting. I don't know if I'd go that far. I mean, that defense for the Rams, I think played pretty well last year and obviously benefited from having a one-of-one defensive tackle. Even if it was his last year, he still was just a massive difference maker in there. As good as some of these other guys had as rookie seasons, like Kobe Turner and Byron Young, even Ernest Jones, the veteran linebacker who is very good, playing behind Aaron Donald or next to Aaron Donald is a very different thing than playing next to Braden Fisk. And I thought that was one of the biggest reaches in the draft was the Rams putting all the draft capital they did to move up and draft Braden Fisk. I really liked almost everything else they did on draft day, but that move in the second round could end up being incredibly costly because there's a lot of players that they could have added. And I think that was we'll see. I've never been big on Fisk. So we'll see. I love the Jared Verse edition. Cam Kitchens, when they got him, I think was a good addition. You and I have talked about Brennan Jackson. I think the combination of Brennan Jackson and Jared Verse are a great pairing. if the veteran corners work out, I think that's great. Cam Curl as a veteran safety that they got. I mean, they made a lot of moves that I think are really good. But I still think it's a very young team with a high variance. And so I don't think it's as easy as like, hey, they've got it. I mean, if you look back at the Seahawks games against them last year, I mean, they should have won the game in LA.
That was the most frustrating game this season.
I mean, they had that game. I mean, all you had to do is for Jason Myers to make a kick and they win, but
or Drew Lock not to have the worst set of offensive plays you've ever seen.
Right. I mean, for Gino to come in with half of a shoulder and almost lead the game-winning drive again. But they lost that game 17-16. And then the other game against the Rams, where am I missing it?
That was the first game of the year.
Game.
That was
first game of the year. The Seahawks were up at halftime.
Yeah.
And then they lost both their starting tackles and played at half without either starting tackle. And it was kind of a nightmare second half. But do you really feel like they're a significant tier different than the Seahawks as it stands?
I think at this point, because I'm expecting a year of turnover for this. I'm not turnover, an adjustment year from the Seahawks. I think there's going to be, because of what you talked about, the coaching staff. I think personnel-wise, no. I think personnel-wise, they're really close. I just think because of a lot of the coaching changes and the adjustment they were going to make versus a pretty established quarterback, an established head coach. But roster-wise, no, I don't think that at all. I think they're really, really close. I think Seattle might have more talent. It's just the quarterback and coaching difference right now. But I think once McDonald and Grubb I really look for Seahawks what they're doing the second half of the year. I think by the end of the second half of the year, if things go the way I think they're going to go with this coaching staff, I think they're really going to be trending upwards. There's a lot there that I like, but I think they're going to have adjustments, and I'm expecting this year it's going to take time. And it took Baltimore really until they got Roquan Smith, but there was a big adjustment when Mike McDonald first got there, and considering what they were doing with Pete Carroll and Clint Hurd. So to answer your question, roster-wise, I don't think so, but I just think where they are just with coaching, I think that's really where my difference is.
It is worth calling out. The Rams lost to the 49ers 30-23, and then they beat them 21-20. Now, they beat them 21-20 in the last game of the year.
That was with backup quarterbacks.
With backup quarterbacks playing. So I just don't know that you can really say much about that game, Sam Darnold versus Carson Wentz. But they only lost the 49ers by 7 points in the first game. So, I mean, they were within reason. I think the place that, for me, the Rams are far and away better than the Seahawks are offensive line. Offensive coaching, we don't know because we haven't seen Grubb in the NFL, but I think it's fair to say McVay is one of the best offensive coordinators around. And then they're definitely, I think, at quarterback, Stafford is the best quarterback in the division.
Yeah.
And as much as I like Gino, there's definitely there is a lot of difference there. Until Gino proves otherwise, there's a big difference there. But defensively, I mean, I think the Seahawks have a more athletic secondary, and maybe some better overall players on the secondary, and they have a better defensive line. Like a defensive tackles group is better, and we get to see now what is Byron Murphy and Mike Morris this year and Leonard Williams and Jaron Reed look like against what will be a new offensive line for the Rams.
Yeah.
For the 49ers, he talked about that their offensive line's a problem. So he had offensive line as a emphasis point for both the Rams and the 49ers. You and I have talked about that. I thought it was one of the most glaring omissions in any team's draft was watching the 49ers go wide receiver first and not make any move to acquire. I mean, when they got snaked for Roger Rosengarten, I think that must have just killed them in that draft room.
I think Baltimore jumped them with that. I think they traded up to jump them or something of that nature. It was one pick before them.
It was.
And me and you were really worried a lot of the process. We thought 31 was just the sweet spot for that back half of some of the offensive tackles. And Jordan Morgan was one we were looking at. He went a lot higher than I would have thought. I think he went in like the early 20s.
Yeah.
And this draft looked worse than if they locked in that right tackle or one of the guard spots. They got Dominic Pooney in the middle rounds. He's a solid player. We liked him for Seattle, but right tackle was a big problem for them last year. Trent Williams is getting older, so a future left tackle. They're also one injury away, and we saw their splits last year when Trent got hurt. I think they lost every single game he didn't play last year.
Every game that he didn't play the full game, they lost.
Yeah. And right tackle was a problem. I think you're right. I think it was shocking that none of their first two picks went to offensive tackle. And I think it was a big issue with their draft. And I know some of their writers will tell you they had the best draft of all time, but I was very shocked that they didn't address that position.
Yeah, and so, I mean, that's a team where we talk about Stafford being such a linchpin for the Rams. You can say, oh, well, the starting quarterback's a linchpin for every team. Well, I think the Seahawks have a guy that started 18 games and showed a lot of promise as a young player. I don't think that the total season is lost if Geno Smith is out for a game or two or 6 or whatever it would be.
No.
Jimmy Garoppolo, it's interesting. The depth chart I was looking at did not have him on there, and I forgot about him. He's obviously started a lot of games, but he's already proven his ceiling is pretty low. And who knows how he's going to do in McVay's system. The guy throws a lot of picks, and that's a huge difference in general. Obviously, Howell's throwing his fair share of picks, but I'm not sure that would be a viable replacement.
I thought it was very telling the Rams targeted Howell.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And they did not get a backup in the draft, which was a little bit of a surprise.
Yeah.
But the 49ers, point being, is they also, people don't realize it, but they're a Trent Williams injury away from having a significantly different profile. What's your take on the 49ers offseason? Have they treaded water? Are they roughly the same as they were last year? Do you think they're better than they were last year? Maybe because Purdy's going to have had another year of experience. Do you think that they're worse than they were last year? What's your general read?
I think they're slightly worse than last year. I think at best, the best case you can make is that they've treaded water. They have pretty much their entire offense back. So none of those receivers getting traded was pretty advantageous for them. But we saw what happened. Kittle in the Super Bowl and Trent Williams getting injured. We saw some signs of aging with that offense. And obviously McCaffrey, his splits when he's not playing. But defensively, they've lost. Dre Greenlaw is pretty much going to miss this season. He tore his Achilles in the Super Bowl. He is a huge part of what they do, having those two linebackers. So the only replacement for him was, I think, the guy from Green Bay, who was an older player that kind of fell off last year. And Devondre Campbell, he is not Drake Greenlaw. He's not even close to Drake Greenlaw. And secondly, they lost Eric Armstead. And Eric Armstead was not the player. They made a big mistake. They chose the wrong defensive tackle, and then they drafted Javon Kinlaw, who left as a free agent. So they've made a couple moves here and there. Like the Chase Young thing didn't work out. They brought in Leonard Floyd, probably a better pass rusher at this point, or more complete than Chase Young. But losing Armstead, losing Greenlaw, some of the safeties, they got Malik Mustafa, which I hated. The one that on our show, we were just, I hate what he can do for them, but I don't think there's a case to make they got better. I think treading water is the best case scenario you can make.
What would be the case to say that they got better? I mean, one would be what I started with Brock Purdy and him being, a better a better, more seasoned quarterback, run the system even better with Shanahan, having played in the Super Bowl now and led what could have been a game-winning drive at the end of the Super Bowl. So you're playing with a lot of confidence. That's a pretty big deal. I think you could talk about, I mean, Eric Armstead missed a bunch of time. Malik Collins could be in there more consistently. You could say they're going to start the year with Leonard Floyd, where they didn't start the year with Chase Young, and they had a half of a line that wasn't particularly playing very well. And Leonard Floyd had better pass rush numbers in some ways than Chase Young. So maybe that's an upgrade. You could say that Jair Brown had a decent rookie year. Now he'll step in as a starter. That's one that I think is a sneaky change. Tayshaun Gibson was a big part of that defense, and a veteran, was in the right place at the right time, a lot of places. I think you could maybe if Renardo Green ends up being a great rookie corner, like there's a lot of things that would have to happen, but all of it feels a little bit optimistic.
Yeah, it's mostly young guys, and you're really trying to hope. I think the best case for defensively is maybe coaching. The Steve Wilkes thing, he was defensive coordinator last year. He struggled, and him and Kyle Shanahan were not seeing eye to eye. They had to pull him out of the booth and bring him on the field, or it might have been the reverse. It might have been something like that. But they brought in they've run the Pete Carroll defense, and they have a new coordinator running that defense again. They also brought Brandon Staley in. He's essentially like the co-defensive coordinator.
Mm-hmm.
Before he blew up as a head coach, and he was awful as a head coach, but he was like the star defensive coordinator with the Rams, and he's there in the building. So if he's the actual defensive coordinator, that could help a lot, because Steve Wilkes, he called that terrible call at the end of the Super Bowl, and they lost some games because they were just tackling like shit all year. So I think that's the best case, but man, Dre Greenlaw is so important to what they do. It's hard for me to say they got better. I think really it's Purdy in the defensive coaching. And if Purdy takes another step forward, that would suck for all of us. But they were so efficient on offense last year. It's just their defense was not right all year. And personnel-wise, I don't see a lot to think it's going to be back to kind of where it was.
Yeah, I if I look at the 49ers in terms of games lost, do you have that up somewhere? If you look at teams that lost games due to injury, starter games due to injury, I might look that up. But if I'm looking at, they got 16 games, they got a full season out of Christian McCaffrey. Christian McCaffrey in, a couple years earlier, he would miss 6, 7, 10 games due to injury. So a full season out of Christian McCaffrey. They got a full season out of Purdy, which seems fine and reasonable that they'll keep doing that. They got 15 games out of Deebo Samuel. If I look at Deebo's history, that was, as many games as he's had as a starter. And then you look at guys like, who's the other one? Well, we talked about Trent Williams. He started missing some games. It just feels like this is a team. George Kittle, I guess, they got 16 games out of George Kittle.
Yeah.
George Kittle usually misses 2 to 4 games in any given year. So I just wonder if their injury luck also is something that's a team that just plays very physical football, and they're a year older. And I just wonder, and they played more games, more snaps than any other team with all the playoff runs. That's another, I think, risk for that team.
Yeah, and I think the big one we haven't even touched on yet is teams that lose the Super Bowl in that kind of fashion typically don't come back and have a great year the next year. There's usually some internal issues in the building, and we saw it with the Seahawks, and we've seen look at the Philly last year. They were that close, and then the next year, things kind of went south. And the year they lost the Super Bowl to Kansas City, I think they didn't make the playoffs the next year, the first time. So the whole Deebo Ayuk situation is going to be lingering. If Deebo kind of goes sideways, that he might be traded soon, that can have a big effect in the building. I think Kittle's age, I've been looking at this roster, and it feels like they're nearing the end of this run on offense. Obviously, if Purdy's as good as some people think he is, they're going to be good for a long time. But to have like the kind of dominant roster that they have on offense, I don't think they're going to be able to sustain this for many more years. They can't afford all these guys. Once they have to pay Ayuk, Debo might come out, and that's probably why they drafted Ricky Pearsall so high. They're planning for that. But yeah, I think the fact that like they got that close and lost again, and they lost because of their own ineptitude on defense, and they couldn't stop Mahomes, and it's hard to get back up there again. And I think those are fair questions. I think they've had really good injury luck, especially with McCaffrey, who was really banged up in Carolina. And if he comes out of the lineup, he's their best player on offense other than Trent Williams. So that could limit their growth for sure.
I am looking right now. I finally found this. Where is it? Adjusted games lost. From our friend Aaron Schatz, formerly of Football Outsiders, now of FTN Fantasy. And where is the 49ers? 49ers. So they ranked second. Is second good? Okay, yes, it is good. I was right. So they ranked second in the NFL in offensive games lost due to injury, meaning they had the second best injury situation. Defensively, they ranked sixth in the NFL for games lost due to injury. Overall, the 49ers ranked fourth. So,
Fourth.
And if you go back to 2022, they ranked 24th. So to go from 24th to fourth is a pretty huge variance. And I think that you can expect similar variance from that team, just given the way that they've come together. Let's talk about the Falcons first. Or Falcons, my goodness. I would like to talk about the Falcons, but let's talk about the Cardinals. Talk about the Cardinals. We got to start with, I guess, the quarterback. I see him very differently than I think a lot of people see him. I think a lot of people see him as a number one overall pick. They see him as a dynamic athlete. They see him as, a highlight reel kind of player with great arm, great legs, moves a mile a minute. And I see him as the guy that his teammates have said, thrown shade his direction in public. I've seen him as the guy who, when the games start going the wrong way, he kind of folds the tent up and stops playing. I see him as the guy that as soon as there's any potential, like not even like he's about to get hit and protecting himself, but as soon as there's any pressure, he goes down. I don't see him as a guy that is built to win in the moments that matter. I would rather have Geno Smith and his contract than Kyler Murray. That I realize for a lot of people is crazy. To me, it's like very easy. I'd much rather have the situation we have with Geno.
Yeah, Kyler reminds me of an NBA player. Like a lot of the guys, like you might look at like kind of a Russell Westbrook and what he was before. He's kind of turned into himself, where you watch him and you see how talented he is, and he can run around and make plays and put up stats. And like a lot of like Russell Westbrook used to like average a triple-double with the Thunder. I don't want to bring up the Thunder on here, but he wasn't actually that good. Like he couldn't win on his own. He could just put up stats. And we've seen what happened with Westbrook kind of once he went around. I see a lot of that with Kyler. Kyler's like a fun player. He's exciting. They had horrible backups last year. When those backups played, they were a rough watch. Josh Dobbs was okay at the beginning, and then they had the other backup. I can't remember his name, but Kyler brought a lot of life to them. But there's so much talk like, oh, they got a number one receiver now. Kyler can unlock him. They had DeAndre Hopkins in his like peak for a lot of those years with Cliff Kingsbury. They were never a threat. They just put up some nice plays. I think Marvin Harrison will get his stats. I'm with you. I see Kyler Murray as the kind of guy who's going to fill stats. He'll make a lot of exciting plays, but with the game on the line, or if you ask him to beat San Francisco or like a quality team, I thought Arizona had most of their success at the end of last year running the ball. James Conner. And I don't know. I'd be very worried. The fact that they had to like put some of those clauses in his contract, and I think Kyler's really tried to like change his image over his last year, because coming out of that Cliff Kingsbury era, his image was like they were talking about trading him, and I'm in wait and see mode with him. I want to see him get through another year where I'm not fully as you are in terms of just like you don't want him at all, you don't like him at all. I don't see him as the kind of guy who you're typically going to be like a winning program with. I see him as a guy like an NBA player, and I think there's a lot of limitations to that.
If I'm being, the most optimistic about Kyler Murray, if I'm like trying to argue against my own perspective, I would look back at the 2021 and the 2020 season when he had a healthy DeAndre Hopkins and he put up big numbers and that team was winning a lot of games. And so if you say, okay, well, now he's got an even better target in Marvin Harrison Jr., and you've got Michael Wilson, who they drafted last year, who was a solid rookie. He wasn't fantastic, but he should be better this year. I think receivers often make a pretty meaningful jump from year 1 to year 2. And then maybe, they got Tip Ryman. Hey,
their starting tight end is very good.
Trey McBride's good.
Yeah, Trey McBride is very good.
And then they've got, I think the guy actually, not Tip Ryman, I was just joking. I mean, I like him, but Trey Benson, the running back out of, was it Florida State, I think?
I think it was Florida State, yeah.
He's a playmaker. And so James Conner is a different kind of running back. Benson could be a guy that they involve a little bit more in the passing game, and he could help. So I don't think it's totally wild. I don't think the things that I talked about, adversity and how you handle it, like your willingness to put yourself and on the line for your team, the willingness of your team to follow you and your ability to lead them in those moments, I don't think that you change dramatically on that front. And so he might even win more games. He might win 10 games this year. Maybe they make the playoffs. Who knows? That wouldn't dramatically change my perspective because I would bet they will be out in the first round. And I don't think they're ever a threat to go very far in the playoffs. And so, yeah, that's where I struggle with him and the kind of love that gets thrown his direction, especially from Josh Cashman.
Yeah, Josh loves Kyler. I think that's almost as Josh got a thing with the short quarterbacks.
Yeah, it's like a fetish.
Yeah, like Dana likes the tall ones, like the Brock Osweilers but her Josh do not see eye to eye on this.
No. As far as what do you think of the Cardinals offseason though? Like when you look at who they've added, they had something like 6 picks in the top 100 of this draft. And the guys they came out with, Marvin Harrison Jr. is a no-brainer.
Sucks.
But then you're talking about Tip Ryman, Trey Benson, Darius Robinson, Adrian Taylor Demerson, Max Melton. I think Elijah Jones was one of their top picks.
The big corner, yeah.
And then free agency wise, did they really do anything?
I want you to read it. I'm going to go on Our Lads. Are you on Our Lads? Do you have that up?
I do.
Read me their starting defensive line.
Defensive line?
Yeah.
So 3-4. So they got 2 defensive ends and a nose tackle. They've got Darius Robinson, Bilal Nichols as the nose tackle, and then Justin Jones as the other kind of defensive end tackle. Do you want to hear the outside, the edge players?
Yeah, sure.
Zaven Collins and Dennis Gardeck. They've got BJ Ojolari as well as a backup. And don't forget LJ Collier.
Before the draft, LJ Collier was projected as a starting defensive end for them. And you hear those names. Does that scare you?
That's part of what I mean. I think that defense is messy.
It is.
it's messy. We are wringing. What's the phrase? Wringing our hands. I don't know. We are sweating about the Seahawks defense has been so bad for so long, and is it good enough? I could probably name 4 players that are better than anyone on the front 7 for the Cardinals.
Yeah.
And even if you're getting very optimistic, let's say Darius Robinson, a first-round pick, who some people were very high on, maybe he's as good as you can hope for. Where would he rank on the Seahawks?
Like right now, like is Darius Robinson a better player than Draymond Jones?
I would find that very hard to believe.
Yeah. And he's the 3rd defensive tackle.
So yeah, I agree with you. The defense is a big question mark. Budda Baker is amazing. How many years does he have left? Jalen Thompson, I think, is quite good. I think their safeties are quite good. And I think the cornerback situation is a little. I mean, Max Melton's a very big deal for them. They need Max Melton to be not just a passable corner, but a very good corner.
Yeah, and that's the thing with Arizona. They had so many picks, and so much of the media will look at all the names that they have in their top 100, and they'll see the volume, and they'll be like, Arizona had a great draft. I actually tweeted the opposite. I came out kind of underwhelmed, and obviously Marvin Harrison, to me, he was the surest bet of any player in the draft. There's no way that guy doesn't hit.
Right.
But when you think of the opportunity they had in this draft, where I just thought I don't see a lot of difference makers. I think they did a really good job upgrading their depth, like getting a backup running back. They got a backup tight end. But I look at that front 7. That's where a lot of my picks would have gone if I'm trying to rebuild the Cardinals. And they have a really young coaching staff. Jonathan Gannon looked like kind of a joke going into last year. And I thought he was going to suck, and they played their ass off. I was impressed with what they did, given their talent level. They played hard. I think once you get a bigger sample size, I think that goes away over time. And last year everyone thought they were going to get Caleb Williams going into last year. And you look at their team, they make that Will Anderson trade. Like, how much better would their roster look right now with Will Anderson? And that's where I'm looking. I don't see a lot of difference makers. And over time, why defenses tend to be volatile every year is because historically defenses are dictated by blue chip players. And it's really hard to coach up defense, especially the way the NFL is now. It's really hard to coach up and scheme. And when you played Arizona, it was easy to score points on them last year. Even from the games the Seahawks played like crap at the end of the year, they still were able to go up and down the field at the end of the game and win that game. I just see a lot of depth. I don't see difference makers. I see Marvin Harrison, and I see almost none on defense.
I wanted to pull up here. This is from, I believe it's Kevin Cole. Let me double check. Kevin Cole, yes. Who had this interesting way of assessing how much additional value teams added relative to, I think the draft capital they had to work with. I think that's part of what's going on here. So it's measuring reach versus, how many people you reached for, and basically what's the total surplus value that you added by your draft this year.
Wow.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so you're penalized quite a bit if you reach for players, and you're rewarded if you get players that are significantly above their draft position, right? So if you the opposite of a reach. And by this methodology that Kevin does, he's got the Cowboys as number 1. He's got the Eagles as number 2. He's got the Jags as number 3. He had the Seahawks as number 4. And I think if you look at what they did with Byron Murphy and what they did with Christian Haynes, it's a pretty significant portion of what's going on there. But then you also, even the cornerbacks, who a lot of folks were like, hey, I don't know about whether we needed that. From a consensus perspective, DJ James was one of the biggest steals of the draft.
Yeah.
And so the Seahawks are 4th in this measure. Cardinals are 10th. And their reach score, negative 5.1, whereas the Seahawks was negative 1.6. I think their reach was probably things like Tyrese Knight, maybe AJ Barner, things like that we've talked about. And if you go down through, the team that did one of the worst here was the 49ers. They ranked 28th in this measure. The Rams, as much as we liked a lot of how they approached the draft, they had them as 24th. And some of this also has to do with trade. So people got value for trades that they made. The Seahawks trade that they made in the 4th round was a very good one. Some of the trades that these other teams made were not. The 49ers traded up for like running backs and like some weird moves there. So I want to look. There was something else that had how much value teams got out of the draft. I'll see if I can find that as well. But similar. Oh, here it is. Yeah. Let me get this in a new tab and I'll share this. I think we might have talked about this before. At least I might have talked about this, but I'm curious to get your thoughts, Jeff. Yeah, here we go. So have you seen this?
Yes, I have, but I would like to dive in a little deeper here.
So there's 2 axes here. You've got on the vertical axis, you've got talent added. And this is basically the combined ranks of the players on the big board. So the more basically the way that their big board worked is you got more points for a higher graded player. So the more points you end up with is a good thing, as opposed to saying, hey, it's the 50th rated player and you get less points versus the 250th rated player. So it's more points is better. And then on the horizontal axis, you've got value over expected for where you were drafting. So it takes into account basically the rank of the player that you took minus the big board rank, so plus or minus. So this is kind of looking at similarly what Kevin Cole did, is kind of like the horizontal axis on this 2x2. And they've got 4 quadrants, right? And in the top left quadrant, the grade range there is C+ to B, and the high level idea is you added tons of talent, but the value wasn't great. And so it's not surprising that the Cardinals and the Commanders added the most talent out of any teams in the draft because they had the most draft capital. Like, you just have a numbers game there. It's math. Yeah. But as far as what the value was over the expected, like how good did you do with that draft capital? The Cardinals were the second worst team in the NFL, at least according to this board. And the Commanders were like middle of the pack. Like, they largely picked expected players at the positions where they had draft picks. And I think you and I thought it was the best draft. Like, I mean, it was an absolute dream draft that they came out with. When you look at the Seahawks in the top right quadrant, you've got grades B+ to A+. And these are the best drafts where these folks not only added value, but they maximized their picks. And the Seahawks were 4th best. This is the second measure we've looked at that thought the Seahawks were 4th best in the league at adding talent relative to the value that they had available to them. And they're in the top quarter of the NFL in total talent added. They're the only team in the NFC West that's in that upper right quadrant.
And for Arizona to be in that, like, probably the second worst spot in terms of the value they got, when you got a top 5 guy at every single board, and to still end up there, that lines up with a lot of my personal views of their draft. To have 6 picks in the top 100 and to come out with a lot, they got a backup tight end, a backup running back, and those are, by all measures, analytics and quality, those are not difference. That's the final piece you make of a roster. all the media was just falling for them. And I was like, am I missing something? Like, and this chart hits me right between the eyes because this is exactly how I felt. And I think they missed an opportunity. And I think over time, like the hard coaching and all that stuff, I think talent tends to win out. And I see a big missed opportunity from Arizona. That was my read. I tweeted on draft day, day 2 of the draft. I tweeted that, and just asking people around the league. I felt the same way a lot of us did about day 3 of the Seahawks draft. It did feel like a missed opportunity. I was reading your day after column, and you were just talking about how much better the draft would have felt if you put like Troy Franklin at pick 102. But the guy said to me, if you're hand wringing over day 3 of a draft, you're wasting your time. The success of drafts is dictated by round 1, 2, and sometimes 3. And Seattle, by all indications, absolutely nailed their first 2 picks. Like if Murphy goes in the top 12 like he should have, and Haynes goes, and they end up with like Cooper DeJean and Dominic Pooney, like that could have been their draft.
Yep.
And we're not feeling so good. But there were some rankings that what's his name? The guard that they drafted in the top 32. And I see some limitations in his game. I think he should be a starter, but Seattle would be right with Pittsburgh, who I thought had, other than Washington, had the best draft of any team. I absolutely loved what Pittsburgh did. To be them, like touching them right on that, that's really encouraging. And I think Seattle did. And to be honest, a lot of it was luck. And we could talk about it. A huge part of the draft is luck. The Houston Texans wanted to draft Bryce Young last year. They ended up with the second pick and got C.J. Stroud as a consolation prize. They weren't all on board with C.J. Stroud. The Baltimore Ravens drafted Hayden Hurst over Lamar Jackson, and ownership came in and said, we need to take a quarterback because Joe Flacco was there. John Harbaugh, Ozzie Newsome picked Hayden Hurst over Lamar Jackson. And that's what happens with a lot of great drafts. And I think Seattle, pick 1 especially, and then the way they got in pick 3, I liked what they did with those first 2 picks a lot better than what Arizona did. And having 6 picks in the top 100, this was a huge chance for them to really leapfrog Seattle. I was scratching my head at some of the reaction from the media on them. And I think Colin's falling right into that.
What do you think has to happen for the Seahawks to finish second or higher?
The offensive line has to be you did a whole show on Charles Cross yesterday. He needs to take a big step forward. He has not played like a top 10 player. The grades kind of line up to what we've seen in the eye test, but he's been a lot better than the other 2 tackles taken there. But again, that's not saying much. Kyle Hamilton was picked right around there. Garrett Wilson, guys who are Pro Bowl, all pro level players. I think the offensive line has to take a big step forward. And I don't know if that's Charles Cross. I don't know if that's Lucas staying healthy or Oluwatimi or Haynes at right guard. The offensive line is by far the biggest question with this team. I think the second one has to be that one of the 2 linebackers has to be pretty good. And Baker and Dotson, if one of those guys isn't good, they're in trouble. They don't really have Tyrese Knight is their number 1 backup unless it's John Radigan. And if one of those guys get hurt, that could be a big problem. But I think the offensive line really dictates. The offensive line has Jim Harbaugh did that speech about how much it impacts the rest of the team. If the offensive line is good, it has a huge impact. We've seen Geno with good pass protection versus bad pass protection. It's a completely different player. You've seen Jared Goff. What he's like. Geno, I think stylistically is very similar. If the offensive line is adequate, the running game can be better. The passing game can be better. That has such an impact on the entire offense. And I think that more than anything, I think that's the biggest limitation on paper. I think that can change their ceiling more than anything if they're better than expected. And Scott Huff does what he did in Washington.
Yeah, there's no doubt that the offensive line is the biggest question mark and area of variance for the team. I mean, let's just hope that it is a variance and that there's upside there, because I think that's part of the concern. I would add to that Ryan Grubb. If Ryan Grubb is a as good of an offensive coordinator as I hope he is, and that his scheme utilizes players like DK Metcalf and Jackson Smith and Jigba, even Noah Fant, if they use these guys differently and better than they were utilized the last few years, I think that's a big potential opportunity. And I think that the run scheme that they choose to run and how they're going to create, I think, advantages for Kenneth Walker is a big part of it. But for them to finish top 2 in the division, they're going to have a top 10 offense.
Yeah.
Period. Like, no matter how they get there, they have to be a top 10 offense. And I think they'll also need to be a top 20 defense, which is not a high bar. We say this every year, but they were bottom 5 defense last year. And for that to happen, we'll talk about this more in coming days and weeks as we lead up to the season, but Byron Murphy has to be what we want him to be. And I have a lot of confidence he will be. But he and Devin Witherspoon have to be 2 of the best players on the whole team. And if that happens, then like we're on to something. And you kind of reminded me of this so many times. You look at the Seahawks outcomes and it has been frustrating and the way that they've played. But if you really look at their roster and you look at the players 25 and under, there's a lot of guys that you're happy to have on this team. And you just need them to grow up and you need them to be great.
And that's the big thing, because last year they had talent, but it was in a lot of the wrong spots. The fact that within a year, we went to last year thinking this defensive line is a joke. Like, we looked at them the same way we kind of looked at Arizona's defensive line, and they've really transformed it on paper. But for them to really take that step, that needs to become a strength, because what Mike McDonald did so well with Baltimore is they had that spine of their defense. They built that defensive line group. And to have Leonard Williams, Byron Murphy, and then Draymond Jones, Jaron Reed as depth, like, that is a hell of a group. The edge guys, they have solid talent on paper, but no truly difference maker players. But to have as your building blocks, and I thought Mike Sando did a really cool job in his article last week talking to executives, and they said in the last 2 drafts, Seattle could have gone a number of ways, could have gone Jalen Carter. They came out with Devin Witherspoon and Byron Murphy. And if they take Jalen Carter last year, maybe they don't take Byron Murphy this year. Maybe they take one of the corners. And to have those 2 as your building blocks on defense, and really what this team hasn't had is those core players. They've gotten older. It was Jamal Adams and Quandre Diggs. And those were at the wrong position, older players. For this defense to really emerge, and with a defensive head coach, they have 2 what looks like blue chip level players. Those need to they need to hit. And for Seattle to bet better, they have a lot of the depth. They have a lot of the tertiary players, but they need those guys to be frontline player. And then they have Leonard Williams, who, when he was paired with Dexter Lawrence, was a really good tandem there. And he's a really good player on his own. We saw him last year on a bad defense and all the impact plays he made. Now you partner them. It's a really exciting group. They still need to add more. Linebacker and safety are still a lot of stopgaps mostly, but you can really see progression. And on offense, a lot of the skill players are there, but can Charles Cross step forward? Can Abe Lucas get through the season? If you can get good on the offensive and defensive line, there's a lot to build with this group here. It's just Seattle's talented spot, and Tariq Woolen, huge wild card. Smith and Jigba, we saw good things from him. Can he become great? That's where we need Ryan Grubb to really use him differently and really unlock him. He made a lot of splash plays, and I was as big a supporter as anyone, but there's no case that he was great last year. We saw flashes, but the talent is there in a lot of spots, which is why I think Seattle will be a fun team to watch this year, because there's a lot of individual players. It's just on defense, they're starting to get it at the right spots. Now we need to see it on offense, on that offensive line, and in the back 7 of their defense.
Yeah. Anytime you're entering a season with realistic expectations that you're not a contender, then there's a wide number of outcomes that are fine.
Yeah.
And I will not say it's fine for them to finish last, but I don't think it's a disaster if the Seahawks finish last this year in their division. I think that there's a really decent chance that what happens with the Seahawks this year is that they are relatively similar in record to what they've been, but that they've got a better story of how they're getting there, and the underlying fundamentals for how they're getting to those wins is more repeatable, and that they're starting to build something where these players are starting to now come together under a new regime with new scheme, with new tutelage, and that will be building towards what will be another step forward the year after. So it's funny. The most common comment in chat I think I've seen is, I don't care what Colin Cowherd says. Who cares what Colin Cowherd says? I think that's a very fair comment. I think the reason I picked it for us to talk about is, it's always easy to have the action green colored glasses on and thinking about all the good things going on with Seattle and how they're going to be good, and casting doubt on other teams in the division, and to see someone who is a Seahawks fan take it for what it is, predict them to be last place. I thought that was worth a conversation. And actually, I was kind of interested to go through with you and use it as an excuse, if nothing else, to kind of get a feel for which of the division teams took a step forward, which didn't. Where does Seattle fit in that? And I think where I end up, Jeff, is I think the Seahawks, in totality of their offseason, I think probably had the second best offseason. I love, and that includes the moves that they made to remove players. I think the decisions they made to move on from guys and clear their cap out and all that kind of stuff, I think were all really good. As far as which team added the most talent, the Seahawks are probably third in that. So I think things are moving in the right direction. I love our coach. I think that is a huge part of this offseason. You could argue if you take that into account, you could say maybe they're number one of the teams in the division, but we won't really know that until they start playing games.
And that's really what I'm watching this year. The talent, I think you're right. In free agency, I don't think they added a single true impact difference maker that's going to be a core player for a while. It was mostly stopgaps. I like what they did strategically at linebacker. I know a lot will disagree, but I think linebacker is a position right now you want to get cheap in, and you want to give guys with upside shots. I think Dodson's a guy me and you identified, but I don't think there's any difference makers there when they had Bobby and KJ there like the Niners do now. But I think Mike Macdonald is really the biggest X factor. We don't know. And that's what this whole season's about to me. Do we see the signs that he can be great? Because even when I hear him talk now, he's getting more self-confident. I thought his press conferences this week after the mini camps was the most self-assured I'd heard him. He sounded like someone obviously was joking around. He didn't know what to do in running his first practice, but he seems more confident in his skin a lot more than he was in some other interviews, a lot more than honestly John sounded in a lot of his interviews. So I think Macdonald, what he did so well was just player utilization and demanding excellence, and the defensive coaching in Seattle the last almost 8 years has just been atrocious, and their ability to maximize talents and adjust to schemes and just how they got dummied by a lot of these offensive masterminds. Essentially, McVay and Shanahan got Pete Carroll fired, and they lapped him. And seeing what Macdonald can do with these same players and where they're trending at the end of the year, that's really what I'm watching this year. I don't care if they do finish last, but if the last 4 games, sort of like that Matt Hasselbeck year you always reference, you could see those last 4 or 6 games, these guys have something and they're going to be good. They had Mike Holmgren, one of the best offensive coaches, and it carried over into the next year. The 2011 season with the Seahawks, you really saw that something was with that defense. And everyone will go back. A lot of people who didn't watch the Seahawks will be like, they were 7-9. They didn't have Russ yet. That's not how I remember the end of that season. And that's what I'm looking for this year, especially with the coaching. Those games where Mike Macdonald plays, and we're going to learn the schedule in the next week or so. So that's going to be interesting. But those games where Macdonald plays McVay, and Macdonald has been compared to the McVay of defense, and the way he talks, he's by far the most interesting thing about just watching how different they're going to look offensively and defensively. And you know Ryan Grubb a lot better than I do. And there's a lot of someone was talking on a podcast this week about how one of the guys the whole league is most excited to see is Ryan Grubb. And I know Albert Brewer's talked about that. a lot of teams tried to bring him into NFL buildings. Nick Saban identified him as the best offensive coordinator in college football. So their coaches are far more interesting. Shane Waldron is also like one of the most biggest jobs of anyone in the NFL this year. So we're going to learn a lot about him. We're going to learn a lot about the Seahawks coaches. I find that far more interesting than what the record ends up being.
You're firing me up, Jeff.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. It is going to be so nice to watch a different offense, a different scheme, watch a different defense, different scheme. And if they make mistakes, they're going to be different. They're going to be different. It is not going to be banging our heads against the wall, watching the same crap that we've watched for so many years now, especially on the defensive side of the ball, but also on offense. I think offense has been frustrating in its own way. So I'm right there with you. And I think that's a good point, a good segue you brought up relative to Mike Sando. I just shared a little bit ago, Mike Sando is going to be my guest tomorrow. So tomorrow morning, we will have another Hawk Blogger Mornings, and I will start at probably about 7:30. Mike Sando will join me at 8 o'clock, 8 a.m. Pacific time. And Mike was at rookie mini camps, so I'll talk to him a little bit of anything that jumped out to him, as well as anything else that's going on across the NFL and within the division. Mike, as far as I'm concerned, is the GOAT beat reporter for the Seahawks, and known him for a long time, so looking forward to catching up with him. I have a Seahawks player. You don't know who, but I have a Seahawks player lined up to come on the show looking like Thursday. Looking forward to having that conversation. Not a guy that I think has done a lot of interviews, and a guy that I have a lot of interest in and what's going to happen with him this year and what's happening around him this year. And Tuesday, Jeff, you'll like this one. I was going to do it tomorrow, but with having Sando coming on tomorrow, I pushed it to Tuesday. I've gone through and done the research and compiled every single trade John Schneider has made in the draft in his tenure, every time he has traded back, every time he's traded up, and I'm going to go through the results of those moves. And I want to add that to the Seahawks ecosystem of conversation, because there's a lot of folks out there that are basically saying that there's only one way to approach the draft and there's only one way to do things. And I always am very skeptical whenever someone sees things as that black and white. They always tend to be the data science guys. Even though I like my data science guys, they always tend to think there's only one right way to do things. I'm going to talk about that, and I think I'm going to demonstrate why that's not the case. That'll be Tuesday. I'm looking forward to having that show as well. So a lot of good stuff coming up on Hawk Blogger Mornings. Wednesday, we'll be back with Real Hawk Talk. Hopefully, Jeff will be available. We'll see. We'll see who we can get on the crew. We have to get Evan back on. So we got a lot of good stuff coming up. Jeff, thank you for taking part of your weekend to come on, and appreciate it, man.
I'm very fired up. I can't wait to hear what Sando has to say. He's not down in a lot of camps anymore, and there's no better beat writer of the Seahawks than he was when I started following the team. So, and the Tuesday show, there's been some takes that I've just been left scratching my head. And I'm very curious to see where your research comes. But the thing I just want to end quickly on this.
Yeah.
Every draft is not the same. You can't go into it. I've kind of taken some swipes of this. You can't go into a draft thinking there's, like last year, for example, if you look at the players that went 13 to 20 and compare them to this year, it is a remarkably different draft class. And every draft has to have a different approach based on that draft, where your team is. And like the Will Anderson trade was beloved by analytics and the paper. And obviously that's a results over process thing because Houston shocked everyone. But that trade ended up horribly for Arizona. And then Seattle, if they had traded back to Green Bay, and if they don't trade your guy Barden, this draft that's Cooper DeJean most likely. And last year, if you took 15th pick or something, that was Will McDonald, who you really liked. But if you look at Will McDonald, who they've already replaced, by the way, they traded for Hassan Reddick. Where do you think Will McDonald would have gone in this draft? I think in the late 20s. And Tyree Wilson went 7 last year. Is Tyree Wilson a better prospect than Byron Murphy? And so year over year, we see a ton of variance in terms of quality. So I'm going to be really interested to see what you come up with there, because I think every year is a completely different ecosystem. Every draft is a completely different ecosystem. You can't look at it one way. I think that's a very foolish approach. Why I really like talking to Sean when we had him on. He had that thinking, but he was way more open-minded. And so I took some swipes at some of the people you're referring to this week, and I'm curious if the research proves me right or wrong.
I will be excited to share the outcome of that conversation on Tuesday. And everybody, that's Jeff Simmons at Real Jeff Simmons on Twitter. Thank you for joining today, Jeff. And thanks everybody for tuning in. If you haven't already, give the show a like, click subscribe. We're over 10,000 subscribers. We are marching on our way to 11, 12, 13, and beyond. And if you haven't clicked on the link in the description of the video where you can become a YouTube member, please do. It'd be great to have you join as a YouTube member and join as a patron. Patreon.com/hawkblogger. That is where the audio version of all these podcasts go. And so if you want to get the audio version, you don't have to burn your battery power watching YouTube with it unlocked in your pocket as you're walking around. Get the audio version, patreon.com/hawkblogger, as well as access to the Slack channel and a bunch of other great things. So until tomorrow morning, have a great rest of your Sunday evening. I'm Brian Nemhauser. This has been another episode of Hawk Blogger Mornings.